I remember the first time I stared through a thermal scope and saw something that broke my mind in half. The valley below was dead quiet, a frozen wash of stone and silence, when the screen lit up with a shape too big to make sense of. The image burned white against the darker terrain, a body of impossible height, moving with calm, deliberate purpose. My brain tried to shrink it into something reasonable. A man standing close, a cluster of figures overlapping, a heap room. But it wasn't any of those. It was one thing, massive and alive. People talk about the Kandahar giant like it's folklore, something traded around campfires or whispered in barracks halls. But what I saw wasn't a story. And what soldiers across Afghanistan kept seeing wasn't rumor. They were moments, fleeting, silent, but real enough to leave cracks in the mind. The official reports never mention them, of course. They talk about insurgents, ambushes, IED strikes, but they never describe the things that stalked the upper ridges, where the mountains swallowed signal and sunlight both. The men who spoke about them after deployment always did it the same way, quiet, measured, with that distant look of someone still half inside the memory. These weren't conspiracy chasers. They were the kind of people who didn't flinch when rockets fell, who had no reason to invent monsters. Yet they all described the same impossible sight, giants walking the high valleys, glimpsed through scopes that don't lie. Afghanistan's peaks have always felt older than time itself, like the world forgot to move forward there. Locals say the mountains breathe, that they remember everything, that not all who live there are human. Those of us who patrolled the ridgelines learned fast that the terrain itself was an enemy. Razor slopes, hidden caves, echoing canyons that made distance meaningless. Thermal optics were our lifeline. You trust them more than your eyes. They don't blur with exhaustion. They don't imagine shapes. They show heat and motion, truth stripped of guesswork. So when that screen shows a humanoid form twice the height of any man, you feel the floor of reason give way. I wasn't alone in that. I've heard the recordings, the testimonies that never left classified drives, Air Force drone feeds capturing figures taller than vehicles, patrols reporting contact with silhouettes that stepped over boulders like they were pebbles. One operator described watching 8 beings gathered around a campfire, each one 3 to 4 meters tall. He confirmed the measurement using range data built into his display. They weren't attacking anyone. They were just living, tending fires, moving like a family at rest. Even the goats near them looked toy-sized. 10 minutes later, the drone moved out of range, and the moment ended. He said the strangest thing wasn't their size, it was how normal they seemed. Another soldier, up north near the Panjshir Ridges, had a similar encounter in 2008 while testing a new recon thermal device. He'd been scanning a tree line when a bright mass caught his eye. Large, fixed, like a group huddled around a heat source. Then the cluster stood up, one being 12 feet, maybe more. The trees nearby were nearly the same height, and it towered over them. He said it moved easy, unhurried, but with strides so long it vanished into the next valley in seconds. He didn't tell anyone for years, not until he heard another soldier describe the Kandahar giant on a late-night radio show. Then, everything came back. The sight, the cold rush of disbelief, the way his hands had trembled without his permission. He remembered, too, how the villagers dyed their goats bright orange sometimes, their own hair the same shade. He'd thought it was ritual or superstition. A week later, the dyed goats would vanish. The people's hair faded back to black, and no one explained. Now he wondered if those sacrifices were meant for something real, something watching from the ridges. The idea sounds crazy until you've spent a night up there, surrounded by caves and wind that carries voices you can't place. You start to believe the land itself trades in secrets. If something enormous lived in those hollows, something the locals have bargained with for generations, it would explain a lot. The orange dye, the offerings, the silence. You learn to respect silence out here. It's the oldest language the mountains speak. One analyst told me about reviewing full-motion video from the Korangal Valley, sometime between 2012 and 2018. He'd been monitoring a group around a fire, documenting their routines for a pre-mission intelligence brief. All standard. Then 2 figures he thought were crouched together under a blanket stood up and merged into one. A single individual that dwarfed everyone else. It bent almost double to step through a mud hut doorway. The villagers didn't panic, they just made space. They knew it. It belonged there. He said it felt like watching an ancient truth bleed into the modern feed of a digital world. That's what gets you, the casualness of it. The quiet way these things exist beside us, unrecorded but undeniable. The reports never reached command. You can't put giant humanoid in a SIG without killing your career. So the files vanish, and the sightings stay whispers among those who can't forget what they saw. I used to think myths were born from fear. Now I think they're just memories that survived too long. Afghanistan keeps its memories well. The mountains of Afghanistan rise like colossal tombstones, layered with the weight of centuries. Even in daylight, their faces look ancient, carved by something older than weather, older than time. Every soldier who spent a night in those valleys knows that silence there doesn't mean peace, it means you're being watched. The terrain twists reality. A ridge that seems half a mile away turns out to be 2. A shadow you think is a tree moves like it's breathing, and the air itself feels charged with a kind of static, a hum of something alive under the rock. We used to joke that Afghanistan hated us, that the land itself was against our presence. But over time, it stopped feeling like a joke. The locals had stories about the men of the high caves, legends passed down like warnings disguised as folklore. Most Americans dismissed it as superstition until soldiers started seeing shapes that made no tactical sense. Massive heat signatures moving between compounds, always just beyond rifle range. What unnerved everyone wasn't that they appeared. It was that the equipment didn't misread. Thermal optics don't lie. They track heat, not shadows. They show life, not imagination. When a 12-foot silhouette walks behind a 2-meter wall and still shows from the chest up, the numbers don't leave room for doubt. That's not distortion, that's geometry. One lieutenant told me how he verified it himself. He used his Alev's laser rangefinder to measure the compound's walls, then the target's distance, 1,800 meters out, give or take. He checked it twice, then a third time when disbelief set in. The reading stayed the same. The wall was roughly 6 feet high, which meant that whatever moved behind it stood twice that height or more. He said his pulse slowed in that strange way it does when adrenaline hits but panic can't find the shape. The figure just walked, unhurried, its stride easy and deliberate, like it had nowhere to be. No sign of hostility, no sign of awareness that it was being watched. He followed it until it vanished behind another structure. 5 minutes that felt like an hour. He didn't tell anyone, not his men, not his superiors. You don't come back from saying something like that. You keep it buried, let it rot in silence. But silence is a poor graveyard. It never really holds the dead. Over the years, stories like his began to align. Different provinces, different units, different years, but the same description repeated in eerie precision. Beings far taller than human, moving with uncanny speed, some seen alone, others in groups, their presence too consistent to dismiss. The official line remained the same, nothing unusual recorded. But what's unusual in a place where maps have edges no one's verified? The deeper you go into the mountains, the less the world feels mapped at all. The air gets thin, sound carries wrong, and distance stops behaving. I remember one patrol near Nuristan where our comms went dead for hours without explanation. The radio static pulsed like a heartbeat, then went silent altogether. We found tracks in the shale that didn't match anything we knew. Bipedal but huge, each step sinking into rock that should have held firm. The interpreter with us went pale. He said something about sons of the old fire. Wouldn't translate the rest. I didn't press him. You learn not to. You start understanding that what they call myth isn't always fiction. It's survival knowledge, the kind their grandparents learned the hard way. The older men in those villages never went into the upper caves. They burned offerings near the entrances and left without turning their backs. They said those who faced the mountain too long never came home the same. I didn't believe it then. I do now. The intersection between their customs and our technology told a story neither side could fully see. The villagers used color and ritual to keep something appeased. We used rangefinders and thermal optics to stumble across the same thing they feared. When you strip away culture and language, all that's left is behavior, and both sides were reacting to the same presence. What scared me most wasn't that something lived up there. It was how easily it avoided us. Drones flew over those ranges every night. Satellites mapped the terrain in detail down to the meter. And yet, these beings walked unseen until they wanted to be seen. That means intelligence, strategy. They weren't wandering animals. They were residents who knew exactly where our technology failed. If they'd been watching us as long as we've been watching them, maybe longer, they'd already learned how to remain ghosts. Some soldiers said they felt eyes on them in the fog, saw stones shift when the wind was still. Others swore they heard low sounds that weren't wind or animals, deep, rhythmic pulses that seemed to come from the ground itself. I've been there in that silence, staring into black valleys where nothing moves but everything feels awake. you start to realize that the world isn't small just because we've mapped it. The maps only tell us where we're allowed to look. Everything beyond that, the high caves, the hidden ridges, the whispers that crawl through the rock, belongs to something else entirely, and it doesn't want to be found. Afghanistan's mountains are not just landforms. They are barriers between worlds. They rise like jagged sentinels of another age, their caves breathing the same cold air that must have filled them 1,000 years ago. Every patrol up there felt like entering a place untouched by time. The world narrowed to dust, wind, and the hum of the optics pressed against your eye. You learned to measure your sanity by the steadiness of your scope. Through that lens, the terrain revealed its ghosts, and among shapes that mocked logic itself, I'd hear men talk odd in the quiet after chow, always in fragments. An FMV analyst who swore he'd seen something bend almost double to fit through a mud hut doorway, while villagers carried on like it was nothing. A drone operator who couldn't shake the image of figures 3 times human size, sitting by a fire, as calmly as a family dinner. None of them spoke with hysteria, just the plain certainty of witnesses describing what their instruments had recorded. The more accounts surfaced, the clearer the pattern became. These weren't isolated anomalies or one-off hallucinations. They were part of something older, something embedded in the mountains themselves. The idea that such beings could coexist with Afghan villagers wasn't hard to believe once you'd lived among those people. They moved through life with a quiet reverence for the unseen, as though the boundary between the natural and supernatural is thinner there. Their customs carried echoes of ancient pacts. They dyed goats orange, offered them up in ceremonies that Western soldiers mistook for colorful tradition. They whispered to caves before passing them, avoiding eye contact with whatever dwelled beyond the dark. Maybe they weren't worshipping monsters. Maybe they were keeping a fragile truce. The analysts back at the base dismissed it all as local superstition. But superstition doesn't align with laser-confirmed measurements. Superstition doesn't walk behind 2-meter walls and show a full torso on thermal. Those images were real, and they told a story that the official reports would never print. I used to think the military silence meant conspiracy, but after a while I realized it was simpler. No one knew what to do with the truth. You can't file an after-action report on something the world says doesn't exist. I won't say what makes it worse in this conflict. You can't brief a commander on a being that rewrites biology. So the sightings died in the quiet spaces between missions, traded in whispers during night shifts, or in emails that vanished after being sent. I started noticing how the official denials always sounded rehearsed. No records found, no unusual activity reported. Technically true, because you can't report what you're told not to see. The cover-up wasn't some grand deception. It was the inertia of disbelief, a system allergic to what it couldn't define. And yet, across all those years and units, the witnesses described the same physical details: the red hair burning like coals in the sunlight, the 6 fingers, the sheer vertical scale of their bodies. Some even mentioned double rows of teeth, a feature that echoed in older myths. The correlation was unnerving. Ancient texts from the Book of Genesis, Numbers, and even fragments of Mesopotamian lore described warriors of extraordinary stature, offspring of gods and mortals, banished to the wilderness after the flood. The Nephilim, they were called, the fallen. For centuries, those stories were labeled metaphor. But when soldiers half a world away start describing beings that match those same features, the word metaphor starts to sound like a shield for ignorance. Afghanistan could be the perfect refuge for what history tried to erase. The Hindu Kush is vast enough to swallow entire armies. Valleys twist into one another like veins beneath the skin, and there are caves deeper than our satellites can map. Soviet troops reported similar encounters in the 80s, but those documents were buried in KGB archives. Later, Western soldiers in the same sectors reported identical sightings. It's as if the mountains are replaying the same story to each invading empire, showing them the truth, then watching them retreat, pretending they saw nothing. I remember staring at the topographic map once, tracing a contour line that led nowhere, labeled only as restricted terrain. Someone had circled it in red pencil decades before my time. The edges of that mark were faded, smudged by hands long gone, but the implication was clear. Someone else had known. Someone else had tried to chart the unchartable. And maybe they learned the same lesson we did. Some knowledge isn't lost, it's buried on purpose. What unsettles me most isn't the possibility that giants survived. It's the thought that they never needed to hide. We're the ones who stopped looking, blinded by the arrogance of thinking the age of discovery ended centuries ago. Out here, the mountains still decide what we're allowed to see, and sometimes When they choose to reveal their oldest inhabitants, they make sure it's to the kind of people no one believes anyway. When the Australian officer finally came forward, it was almost a decade after his deployment, and the words left his mouth like something dragged up from deep water. He hadn't spoken about it to anyone, not his commanding officer, not his family, not the men who'd shared that outpost with him. The memory had hardened in him, fossilized. But time doesn't erase something that rewires how you understand reality. He'd been stationed in Afghan province, a place of ridges so steep he was damning. His job that night was routine watch duty, manning the thermal turret on his lav, but it was nothing but the traps of the trick, none. The world outside was still and pale, the temperature dropping fast enough to make metal hum. Through the scope, everything looked simplified, black for cold, white for heat. He scanned the village below, noting nothing unusual until a shape crossed the far side of the valley. At first glance, he assumed it was a man walking between compounds, maybe a shepherd or a sentry. Then he noticed the proportions were off. The figure didn't wear the loose, heat-diffusing robes common in that region. Instead, its outline burned clean and bright. It moved differently, taller, straighter, as if distance itself bent around it. He laced the nearest wall to get range, 1,800 meters. The return pinged solid. He checked again, certain he'd tagged the wrong surface, but the data stayed the same. At that distance, a human body should not be that visible, let alone appear at chest height over a 2-meter wall. The math hit him like a punch. The figure had to stand at least 12 feet tall, maybe more. He tracked it for nearly 5 minutes as it moved from one compound to the next, gliding in and out of view with unhurried grace. It never looked toward him, never changed pace. Then it disappeared behind a rise, gone as quietly as it had appeared. The officer sat frozen, staring at the blank valley, listening to the hum of the vehicle's engine. There was no protocol for what he'd seen. He considered logging it, but the thought died before it formed. A soldier claiming to spot a giant would be torn apart by medical evals and psych reviews. So he buried the memory and carried on, like every witness before him. But silence is a poor form of containment. Years later, after leaving the service, he stumbled across an article referencing the Kandahar incident. As he read, fragments of that night flared back to life. The size, the distance, the calmness of the movement. The details matched too closely. He realized he hadn't imagined it. Others had seen them too. Each account followed the same pattern: solitary witnesses, clear weather, long-distance optics, and beings too large to exist. They all used different words but described the same truth. The reports had a uniform rhythm. No embellishment, no dramatics, just the steady recounting of trained observers forced to confront something outside the grid of the known world. That's what made the testimony so powerful. They lacked the chaos of myth. Each one sounded like an entry from a mission log, stripped of emotion. When analysts compared the accounts, they found an eerie alignment. The data points converged into a map of sightings that stretched from Kandahar to Nuristan, each separated by years, yet identical in every measurable way. Even the posture, the gait, the ratio of limb to torso repeated like a pattern stamped across time. It didn't feel random, it felt systemic. And in the shadows of those patterns, another truth began to form. These beings weren't anomalies. They were remnants, survivors of something older, scattered across the last wild corners of the earth. Maybe they had been here long before we climbed out of the mud. Maybe the old stories weren't stories at all, but field reports written in the only language people had back then, myth. It's easy to dismiss what doesn't fit the data. Harder to accept that the data itself might be incomplete. The officer said that realization haunted him more than the sighting, the understanding that he'd glimpsed a fragment of history that refused to die. And if that single moment could upend a lifetime of certainty, what else had we chosen not to see? The giants, he said, didn't need to hide. We were the ones who blinded ourselves. The mountains simply waited, watching the brief empires come and go, keeping their secrets intact. There's a moment every soldier faces, the point when the official narrative and what you've seen with your own eyes split in two and never realign. For the men who witnessed these beams, that fracture became permanent. You could see it in the way they spoke afterward, in the pauses between sentences where words seemed too fragile to hold the weight of what they knew. Some turned to faith, calling what they'd seen a test or a revelation. Others turned inward, chasing explanations that wouldn't come. The military's response, when pressed, was always neat and bloodless. No records exist. It's a phrase designed to close a door. But what that really means is, we don't have a form for this. No section in the report templates, no checkbox labeled encounter with something outside evolution. The system's silence wasn't a cover-up, it was paralysis. Bureaucracies can't handle miracles or monsters. They can only file what already fits the map. The result was predictable. The sightings vanished into whispers, traded in the dim edges of veteran bars and encrypted forums, surviving as rumor where fact couldn't live. And yet, if you gather those fragments together, they formed a picture too coherent to ignore. Distant valleys, night vision feeds, figures measured, not guessed. Each one an independent verification of the same impossible thing. I started to think about what happens when trained observers record the unrecordable. Science claims to follow evidence wherever it leads, but in practice, it obeys comfort. The same way the military avoids chaos by refusing to name it, science avoids dissonance by pretending it isn't there. Evidence that doesn't fit gets pushed to the margins, labeled anomaly, and quietly forgotten. But anomalies are where truth hides. I began to wonder whether these encounters weren't aberrations, but glimpses of something that's always been just beyond the edge of our perception. The mountains make you think that way. Their silence feels sentient. Their stillness purposeful. You get the sense that the land is withholding something, not out of malice, but because it knows we're not ready to understand. The giants, if that's even the right word, seemed woven into that secrecy. Maybe they aren't intruders. Maybe we are. Maybe the world was built for them first, and we're the temporary guests. What unsettled me most wasn't the possibility of their existence, but the quiet intelligence and how they stayed hidden. They understood technology enough to avoid drones. They knew our patrol schedules better than we did. They moved through terrain that defeated satellites, as though guided by memory older than human language. That kind of awareness doesn't come from instinct. It comes from history. Every empire that's crossed those mountains has vanished into dust. Persians, Mongols, British, Soviets, Americans. Maybe the reason no one ever conquers Afghanistan isn't resistance, it's owners of lone. I know we're all in the same place for this city. Maybe the land already belongs to something that's never left. Every witness I've spoken to describes the same aftermath. The memory won't fade. They dream in infrared, see heat silhouettes when they close their eyes, replay those few minutes again and again. They don't talk about fear exactly. It's more like reverence, the way a diver feels staring into the deep. That's the part no one tells you about seeing something beyond reason. It doesn't just scare you, it changes what fear means. Once you've seen a truth that large, nothing else can compare. You stop fearing death or failure. You start fearing blindness. You start fearing the comfort of not knowing. Maybe that's the real secret buried under all the denials and lost reports. Not that these beings exist, but that seeing them forces you to admit how small we are in a world far older and stranger than our maps allow. I think about the silence that follows discovery, the way truth doesn't echo in the corridors of power, only in the minds of those who saw it. Maybe that's why these stories fade before they reach daylight. The people who could confirm them are the same ones trained to bury evidence that doesn't align with mission parameters. A drone operator spots something on a feed, 12 feet of humanoid heat signature moving with precision, and by morning, that footage is gone. No one deletes it officially, it just evaporates, absorbed into the classified void where inconvenient data goes to suffocate. Command doesn't need to issue threats. They only need to remind you that believing what you saw is bad for your career, so you swallow it. You learn to laugh when someone brings up legends. You call it mountain myth or heat distortion. You do what soldiers have always done when reality breaks protocol. You lie to yourself until the lie feels safe. But deep down, you know better. The truth doesn't vanish because it's ignored. It waits. It waits in the static of an archived hard drive, in the testimony of the one man who couldn't keep quiet, in the eyes of a local elder who warned you not to go near a certain ridge. He tried to explain, his words clipped by fear and mistranslation, about pale-skinned giants who threw stones at herders, who lived in the caves and hated light. You thought he meant Taliban fighters. You logged it as potential enemy presence and moved on. Now you know what he was really saying. The villagers weren't superstitious, they were pragmatic. Their stories were maps, drawn in fear and passed down for survival. They knew those mountains belonged to something else, and they'd learned to live with that fact. Western armies came armed with satellites and science, but we never thought to ask the people who already understood the terrain. We treated folklore like noise, never realizing it was intelligence in another language. It's almost funny in a tragic way how arrogance blinds even the best trained eyes. We thought we were there to impose order on chaos, but maybe the chaos wasn't human rebellion. It was the land defending itself through whatever still lives inside it. The Soviets had their own encounters, their own files sealed in basements, their soldiers whispering about mountain men that appeared during patrols and vanished into rock. When their empire fell, fragments of those reports surfaced, thermal readings, autopsy notes without bodies, orders marked "do not translate." Then, decades later, we found ourselves in the same valleys, repeating their mistakes, the same silence, the same denials, the same realization too late that some territories can't be conquered because they aren't unclaimed. They're already occupied, just not by anything we were trained to fight. The elders call them watchers, guardians of thresholds, the old blood. Maybe that's what they are, remnants of another age, left behind to remind us that the map isn't finished. That's the part science doesn't like to admit. We cataloged continents, charted the stars, declared the world known. But known doesn't mean empty. Every generation builds a wall around its understanding and calls it truth. And every so often, something climbs over that wall to remind us how temporary it all is. I think that's why these stories persist, because somewhere in the back of every human mind, there's a memory of sharing this planet with something bigger, stronger, older. We feel it when the wind moves through mountain passes, or when a sound echoes from a cave that shouldn't exist on the map. The giants don't need to show themselves anymore. They already live in the spaces our instruments can't see, the blind spots between frequencies, the margins of light. That's how they survived. And maybe, deep down, that's how reefs survive too, by pretending they're gone. Sometimes I think about the last patrols, the ones who came home changed, or not at all. And I wonder if they saw what the rest of us only glimpsed through scopes and screens. You can't talk about it in debriefs or reports, but those who've seen them carry a look in their eyes, a kind of quiet exile. The truth isolates. It rewrites how you see everything that comes after. Once you've watched a mountain breathe, once you've seen a figure the size of a truck move with the grace of a man, you stop believing the world is small or safe. You realize that civilization is just a thin layer spread across something ancient and waiting. Afghanistan taught us that. Every empire that's entered those mountains has learned the same lesson. The British, the Soviets, us. We came with better weapons, smarter systems, eyes in the sky that could spot a man's shadow from miles away. And still, the land swallowed us. Maybe that's the point. Maybe what lives in those caves isn't meant to be cataloged or conquered. The Afghans say the mountains remember, and I believe them now. I've stood on ridges where the air itself feels haunted, where the wind carries voices you can almost mistake for your own thoughts. That's when you understand that what hides there doesn't need to fight, it just waits. When the Australians withdrew, when our own last units pulled out, those valleys went silent again. The watchers reclaimed their ground. The night skies returned to black, unbroken by drone light. Somewhere out there, those beings still move through the dark, unbothered by the noise we left behind. And the men who saw them, the ones who dared to speak, are left to wrestle with a question that gnaws deeper with every passing year. What if everything we've built, our science, our certainty, our faith in what's possible, is the illusion, and the monsters are what's real? Myths survive because they're true enough to endure. They're field reports written in symbols, archived in story. The giants of scripture, the red-haired beings of legend, the Nephilim scholars dismiss as allegory. Maybe those were just the first sightings, recorded before language could handle what the eye saw. If they've survived this long, they've mastered the art of invisibility. They don't need to fight us anymore. They outlast us. They wait for our empires to crumble and our machines to rust. They are the continuity of the land itself. Sometimes I imagine one of them standing on a ridge long after we're gone, watching the wind erase the last tracks of our tires. To them, 20 years of occupation is nothing, a flicker of light swallowed by a mountain older than history. Maybe that's why they never attacked, why they never revealed themselves in full. To acknowledge us would give us permanence. Ignoring us keeps us temporary. The soldiers who saw them didn't stumble upon a secret. They trespassed into a truth that doesn't belong to our age. And that truth lingers. It hums in the back of the mind when the night is too quiet. When you catch movement in the corner of your vision that disappears the moment you look straight at it. You tell yourself it's memory, imagination, leftover static from war. But part of you knows better. The mountains of Afghanistan still hold their secrets. The watchers still move in their high valleys, unseen and unchallenged. And somewhere tonight, under a sky without moonlight, another soldier is standing watch, scanning a ridge through thermal optics, unaware that something beyond his comprehension is standing on the opposite slope, watching him back. The cycle continues, empire after empire, witness after witness, each believing they were the first to see the impossible. But the mountains know better. They've seen this all before. They always do. If you've made it this far, you already know some stories don't end. They just go quiet until someone dares to look again. The mountains keep their secrets, but the men who've seen what walks there never really leave those valleys behind. Maybe tonight, one of them is finally telling the truth. If you want to hear more stories the world tried to bury, classified encounters, lost patrols, and things that were never meant to be found, hit subscribe, drop a comment below, and join me on the next mission into the unknown. This is Captain Rebel. Stay sharp out there. The dark still remembers.